Welcome back. If you are settling in right now, pulling the covers a little closer, letting the day drift away from you, then you have arrived at exactly the right moment. Tonight, we're going to travel together across centuries and oceans. We're going to sit with sailors in creaking wooden holds, stand in the great harbour yards of ancient Rome, and follow explorers who sailed off the edge of every map that had ever been drawn, into waters where no supply ship would ever find them. This is a sleep story, which means the pace will be slow, the details will be rich, and the world we build together tonight will be vivid and quiet and real. You do not need to remember any of it. You do not need to take notes. You only need to listen, and let your body rest while your mind drifts through one of history's most quietly fascinating puzzles. Here is the question at the heart of everything you're about to hear. How did navies, for more than 2,000 years, feed thousands of men at sea, sometimes for months at a time, sometimes on voyages that crossed entire oceans, without any form of refrigeration, without canning, without freezing, without anything we would today recognize as food safety? The wooden walls of a warship or a merchant vessel offered no cold storage. There was no way to keep meat fresh for more than a few hours in warm climates. There was nowhere on a ship, especially below the waterline where temperatures rose from the heat of packed human bodies, where food stayed reliably safe. And yet the ship sailed. Fleets of hundreds of vessels, thousands of men who needed to eat every single day, or they could not pull ropes, climb masts, load cannons, or steer. A hungry sailor was a useless sailor. A starving crew was a dead ship. The solutions they invented, and the suffering they endured when those solutions failed, shaped not just naval history, but the history of food itself. The salt trade that fed Roman legions and Roman fleets was so essential to the empire that soldiers were sometimes paid in it, which is where we get the word salary. The biscuits that fed the Royal Navy were baked so hard that men would tap them on the table before eating to knock the weevils loose. The discovery that citrus juice could prevent a disease that had been killing sailors for centuries was made and then promptly ignored by the British Navy for decades, because of institutional stubbornness, because of the gap between knowing something and believing it. And the invention that finally changed everything, the sealed tin can, came not from a chef or a scientist, but from a Parisian confectioner who spent 15 years boiling glass jars in his kitchen, trying to figure out why food sealed in glass stayed edible for months. All of that is ahead of us. The story moves slowly and steadily, from the earliest Mediterranean oar-fleets eating dried figs and salted fish, through the great age of sail and the horror of scurvy, through the Napoleonic Wars and the invention that changed the world. Along the way we will meet real people, a Scottish ship's surgeon who tried to save his crew, a cook on Magellan's circumnavigation who watched his shipmates die, a naval administrator who tried to build a bureaucracy capable of feeding a fleet of thousands. Their stories are our stories tonight, so close your eyes or let them rest. Let the world outside this room become quiet. You're going to see tonight, and for the next few hours the only thing you need to do is breathe and listen. 232,660. That was the estimated daily caloric requirement of the crew of a single large British man of war in the 18th century, a ship of the line carrying perhaps 800 men. 800 men who worked brutal physical labour from before dawn until after dark. Men who climbed rope rigging 100 feet above a heaving deck, who hauled gun carriages weighing several tons, who worked the pumps for hours on end when the hull leaked, which it always did. These men burned through calories at a rate that would astonish a modern nutritionist. A sailor in the age of sail required somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 calories per day to maintain his strength during active sea duty. Compare that to the 2,200 calories that most modern adults require, and the scale of the feeding problem begins to come into focus. Now multiply that figure by the size of a real fleet. In 1805, at the Battle of Trafalgar, the British fleet under Admiral Nelson consisted of 27 ships of the line. A ship of the line could carry anywhere from 500 to over 800 men depending on its rate. Conservative estimates put Nelson's total fleet at somewhere around 17,000 sailors and officers. 17,000 men eating every day at sea, weeks away from any port. The logistics of keeping those men alive and functional were as complex as the tactics of the battle itself, and arguably more important, because a fleet that has been starving for 3 weeks does not win battles, regardless of the genius of its admiral. But to understand why the feeding problem was so difficult, we need to go back much further than Nelson, much further even than the age of sail. We need to go back to the very beginning of naval warfare, to the moment when human beings first looked out at a body of water and thought, I need to fight someone on the other side of that. The earliest naval forces we have good records of were the oared galleys of the ancient Mediterranean world, the triremes of Athens, the longships of Phoenicia, the great war fleets of Carthage and Rome. These were fundamentally different vessels from the sailing warships of later centuries, and their food problem was both simpler and more severe. Simpler, because the galley was not designed for long ocean passages. It was a weapon of coastal warfare, a vessel that hugged the shoreline, put into a harbour or beach every night if it could, and rarely spent more than a day or two at sea without access to land. More severe, because the galley was powered by human muscle. Oarsmen, often somewhere between 150 and 200 of them on a trireme, who were working at an intensity comparable to competitive rowing, for hours at a stretch in the heat of the Mediterranean summer. These men consumed extraordinary amounts of food and water. The Athenian trireme has been the subject of intense modern study, partly because a full-scale replica, the Olympias, was built in the 1980s and crewed by volunteers to test ancient claims about its speed and handling. What the researchers discovered about the food requirements was alarming even by modern standards. The oarsmen of a trireme, when rowing at battle pace, were burning calories at a rate comparable to Olympic-level athletes. They needed carbohydrates, they needed salt, they needed water in quantities that a modern sports nutritionist would recognize immediately. What they got in practice was barley, sometimes dried figs, olives when available, salted fish when the fleet was well supplied, and water rationed strictly because a trireme could not carry enough fresh water for a long voyage. The barley that fed the Athenian navy was not the barley we might imagine, not a pleasant grain-side dish. It was consumed primarily as a paste or a rough flatbread, made by mixing ground barley with salt water or fresh water when fresh water was available, and either baking it on a curved tile over a small fire or simply eating it mixed raw into a paste. It was the food of soldiers and sailors and poor men throughout the ancient world, because it was nutritionally dense, relatively resistant to spoilage compared to other grains, and cheap. An Athenian trireme could carry enough barley for its crew to operate for perhaps 3 days without resupply. This was, in practical terms, the operating radius of the Athenian fleet. 3 days from port, or 3 days from a friendly beach where provisions could be found. The logistical implications of this constraint shaped the entire strategy of ancient Mediterranean naval warfare. Battles were fought close to shore. Fleets did not venture far into open water if they could avoid it. The great sea battles of antiquity, Salamis, Actium, the Punic Wars, were almost always fought within sight of land or within a day's sailing of a friendly harbour. When a fleet did have to operate for extended periods, it required a parallel support infrastructure, merchant vessels carrying grain and wine and salted provisions, following the warships like a slow shadow. Without those supply ships, the fighting fleet could not exist for more than a few days. The Romans, who became the dominant naval power of the Mediterranean after the First Punic War in the 3rd century before the Common Era, understood this problem with characteristic Roman thoroughness. Roman naval logistics were built around the concept of the supply depot, a shore installation where provisions could be stored in bulk and distributed to ships as needed. The Romans were extraordinary engineers of infrastructure, and they applied that engineering intelligence to the problem of feeding fleets with the same systematic energy they applied to building roads and aqueducts. A Roman naval depot might contain vast stores of grain, jars of olive oil, amphorae of wine, barrels of salted fish, and the hardtack-like crackers known as bucellatum that were the Roman Navy's equivalent of the later ship's biscuit. But even with these depots, the fundamental problem remained unsolved. Food rotted, water went bad. The Mediterranean summer was brutal, and the wooden hulls of ancient ships were not remotely airtight. A cargo of salted fish that might stay edible for months when stored properly in a cool, dry warehouse could spoil within days in the hot, humid, salt spray-saturated interior of a galley in July. The Romans lost more sailors to starvation and disease than to enemy action in most of their naval campaigns. The Punic Wars, in particular, are notable for the staggering losses Rome suffered not in battle but to weather, disease, and the simple failure of the food supply. In the First Punic War, Rome lost somewhere between 500 and 700 ships. a number that modern historians still find almost impossible to believe, and a substantial fraction of those losses were due to logistical failures. Ships caught at sea without supplies, fleets that had to beach and forage because their provisions were exhausted, expeditions that turned back not because the enemy was stronger, but because the men were starving. This is the world we are entering tonight. A world where the sea was not merely a place of military danger, but a place of profound nutritional peril, where every captain who took a ship beyond sight of land was gambling not just with enemy fire, but with the much more reliable and patient enemy of hunger. Where the question of what went into the hold was, in many cases, more important than the question of what guns went on the deck. The men who solved this problem, or who tried to, and failed, and tried again, were not always admirals or scientists or kings. Some of the most important innovations in naval food history came from people who are barely remembered now. A ship's purser who figured out a better way to pack salt beef, a cook who discovered that one particular barrel of pickled cabbage was still edible after 6 months when all the others had gone off, an administrator who noticed that the ships coming back from one particular port had fewer sick men than the ships coming back from everywhere else, and started asking why. Their names are mostly lost, but their discoveries fed the world. We begin tonight at the very foundation, with salt, the oldest and most important tool in the history of food preservation, and with the question of how something as simple as a mineral could become the difference between a fleet that sailed and a fleet that died. There is a harbour town on the coast of Portugal called Setúbal, and if you had stood in its salt marshes 2,000 years ago, you would have seen something that looked more like an industrial complex than a natural landscape. Flat rectangular ponds, separated by low earthen walls, stretched along the estuary of the Sardo River as far as the eye could see. Workers moved along the dikes between the ponds, checking the water levels, adjusting the sluice gates that controlled the flow of seawater from one pond to the next. In the shallower ponds at the end of the sequence, where the water had been reduced to near saturation by evaporation in the summer heat, white crystals were forming along the edges like frost, piling up in glittering mounds that workers raked and stacked and loaded into ox carts. This was salt production on an industrial scale, and the product being harvested here would travel thousands of miles, to the fishing fleets of Brittany, to the salting houses of northern Spain, to the great warehouses of Roman naval depots along the Mediterranean coast. Salt is, chemically speaking, sodium chloride, but its importance to food preservation is not primarily chemical, or rather, the chemistry is only part of the story. What salt does to food is create an environment hostile to microbial life. Bacteria, which are responsible for the decomposition of organic matter, require water to survive and reproduce. When you pack food in salt, the salt draws water out of the food cells through osmosis, reducing the water content to a level where most bacterial growth becomes impossible. At the same time, the salt that enters the food tissues creates a high sodium environment that is directly toxic to many microorganisms. The result, when the process is done correctly, is a food that can remain safe to eat for months or even years, not because it is fresh, not because it is sealed, but because it has been transformed into an environment where the agents of decay cannot function. Human beings discovered this principle so long ago that the discovery has no recorded history. We only know that by the time written records begin, salt preservation was already an ancient technology, practiced in virtually every culture that had access to either sea salt or mined rock salt. The Egyptian practice of preserving fish in salt is documented in papyri dating back more than 3,000 years. Salted fish was a major trade commodity in the ancient Aegean world centuries before Athens built its first trireme. By the time Rome became a naval power, salt fish, specifically the varieties known as salsamenta, was so fundamental to Mediterranean diet that it was traded across the entire known world, from the fish salting installations on the Iberian coast to the markets of Alexandria to the military camps on the Rhine frontier. For navies, salt fish was the closest thing to a perfect food. It was dense with protein and calories. It could be stacked and packed without containers, unlike grain or liquids. It did not require cooking, though it was better if soaked and then cooked. And under the right conditions, cool, dry, reasonably well ventilated, it could remain edible for 6 months, a year, sometimes longer. The sailors of ancient Carthage, who ranged further from the Mediterranean into the Atlantic than almost any other ancient civilization, carried salted tuna as a primary provision. The Vikings 1,000 years later would build their entire oceanic expansion around dried and salted fish, primarily cod, which could be preserved not just with salt but by simply drying it in the cold Arctic air until it became so desiccated that it was nearly indestructible. A single Norse longship might carry hundreds of dried cod, which could be rehydrated and cooked in a soup pot over a small fire, or simply gnawed on raw as an emergency ration. But fish was not the only thing navies preserved in salt. Meat, primarily pork and later beef, was even more nutritionally valuable, and the problem of keeping meat from spoiling was even more acute than the problem of keeping fish. Fish could be dried as well as salted, which meant that even without perfect salting, a partially dried fish might remain edible for a respectable period. Meat could not be reliably dried in the same way, especially in warm climates, and the consequences of eating spoiled meat were far more severe than the consequences of eating slightly off fish. Bad pork could kill a man in a day. The solution, refined over centuries of trial and error, was the salt barrel. A salt barrel, known in the Royal Navy of the 17th and 18th centuries simply as a cask of salt pork or a cask of salt beef, was, in essence, a wooden barrel packed in alternating layers of meat and dry salt, then filled to the brim with a saturated brine solution and sealed. The meat inside such a barrel was, if the brine had been properly prepared and the barrel properly sealed, preserved against decomposition for anywhere from 6 months to a year or more. The Romans were using a version of this technique for their legions and fleets by the 1st century before the Common Era. The Norse sailors of the Viking Age preserved whale meat and seal meat this way, and when the nations of Western Europe began building the great sailing fleets of the Age of Discovery, salt barrels were the backbone of every ship's provisioning. The logistics of salt procurement were, consequently, one of the most important strategic concerns of any major maritime power. Venice, which was the dominant naval power of the Eastern Mediterranean for several centuries, built its commercial empire partly around its control of salt production in the Adriatic lagoons, the salt flats of the Venetian lagoon, and the salt works at Servia and Chioggia produced quantities of salt that Venice then sold and traded across the Mediterranean and into northern Europe. And this trade gave Venice both the revenue to maintain its fleet and the leverage to ensure that its ships were always provisioned before any rivals. The phrase "worth their salt," meaning worthy of one's wages, valuable, reliable, reflects how deeply embedded salt was in the economic and social life of the ancient and medieval world. Roman soldiers were sometimes paid a portion of their wages in salt, or given a payment specifically designated for the purchase of salt. The Latin word for this payment was salarium, and from salarium came the modern word salary. Every time someone today discusses their annual salary, they are, etymologically speaking, discussing their salt ration. Beyond simple salt preservation, there was another fermented fish product that Romans in the particular used obsessively, and which appears in the provisioning records of Roman military and naval operations with remarkable frequency. This was garum, a sauce made by fermenting small fish, typically anchovies, mackerel, or a mixture of both, in large quantities of salt over a period of weeks or months, then pressing out the liquid and straining it through cloth. The result was an intensely flavoured, salty, protein-rich liquid that was used as a condiment, a seasoning, and a nutritional supplement throughout the Roman world. Roman soldiers and sailors carried small amphorae of garum as a matter of course. It could survive a sea voyage of any length because its high salt and acid content made it almost entirely resistant to spoilage, and it tasted, to Roman palates, of home, which was not an insignificant consideration for men who might be thousands of miles from Italy, eating a diet of dried fish and barley paste for months on end. The garum factories of the ancient Mediterranean coast were substantial industrial installations, and the smell that surrounded them was legendary. Ancient writers compared the odour of a working garum factory to the worst smells that a Roman could imagine, which in a world without modern sanitation took some doing. But the product was valuable enough that the smell was tolerated, and the factories operated continuously, turning out amphorae of the sauce that were shipped across the empire. In Spain, at the site of the modern city of Cadiz, which was then the Roman port of Gades, a crucial waypoint for ships rounding the Iberian Peninsula, archaeologists have excavated the remains of Roman-era garum factories large enough to have supplied the entire Western Roman fleet. The stone tanks where the fish were layered with salt and left to ferment are still there, preserved under the modern city, a reminder that the Romans solved the problem of feeding their navy partly through industrial-scale fermentation chemistry centuries before anyone understood what fermentation actually was. What they did understand, empirically through trial and error accumulated over generations, was that salt worked, that brine worked, that fermentation under certain controlled conditions produced food that lasted. And this understanding passed down through centuries, from Roman provisioners to Viking shipmasters to Portuguese navigators to English naval administrators, was the foundation on which the entire edifice of pre-refrigeration naval feeding was built. It was not a perfect foundation. It was not even a reliable one in many cases. But it was the foundation that existed, and the men who built on it were some of the most practically inventive in history. The question was always, what else could they use? What else, beyond salt fish and salt meat and fermented sauce, could fill a ship's hold and survive a long voyage and nourish a man well enough to work? The answer to that question leads us to a very specific kind of food, a food so unglamorous, so hard, so relentlessly unpleasant to eat, that it has become a kind of symbol of maritime suffering. It leads us, in other words, to hardtack. Take a small amount of flour, add water. Do not add any fat. No butter, no lard, nothing that might shorten the gluten structure or enrich the taste. Mix it to a stiff, dry dough. Roll it thin, perhaps 1/4 of an inch. Cut it into squares or rounds, and punch a regular grid of small holes through the surface. The holes are important, because they allow moisture to escape during baking. Bake it once, slowly, in a low oven, until it is completely dry. Then bake it again. Some bakers would bake it a third or even a fourth time, each pass driving out more residual moisture, each pass making the finished product harder, drier, more shelf-stable, and considerably less pleasant to eat. What you end up with, when you have done all of this correctly, is ship's biscuit, also known as hardtack, also known by the British naval rating as simply bread, though the word bread implies a generosity of texture and flavour that hardtack does not possess. Ship's biscuit was the caloric foundation of naval diets, from at least the classical period through the mid-19th century. It was not the only food sailors ate, but it was the one food that appeared at virtually every meal, in every navy, in every era, because it possessed the single quality that no other common food could match. It lasted. Properly baked and stored in dry conditions, ship's biscuit could remain edible, technically, biologically edible, even if considerably less than pleasant, for years. There are documented examples of hardtack lasting 3, 4, even 5 years in storage, and while it would by that point have been colonised by weevils, possibly by mould along the edges, and so hard that it required soaking in liquid before a man could get his teeth into it without risking a fracture, it retained its caloric content and would, in extremis, keep a man alive. The process of eating hardtack was sufficiently tedious and sufficiently public that it generated a small genre of humour among sailors and soldiers across multiple centuries and multiple navies. The custom of tapping one's biscuit on the table before eating it was universal and practical. The vibration would cause weevil larvae nesting in the biscuit to fall out or move to the surface, where they could be flicked away. Some sailors, particularly those who were very hungry or very experienced, did not bother to tap the biscuit out. Weevil larvae are, after all, a form of protein. But most men preferred to remove them when possible, and the pre-meal ritual of tapping one's biscuit was so ingrained that observers noted it with some regularity in journals and memoirs. One British naval officer of the 18th century wrote, not with any particular alarm, but with the matter-of-fact tone of a man describing the weather, that the biscuits on a particular voyage had been so thoroughly infested that the contents of the barrel were, if you looked closely, actually moving. The other staple that accompanied hardtack throughout the age of sail was the dried pea, and the dried pea was, in its own quiet way, as important as the biscuit. Dried legumes, peas, beans and lentils, were understood intuitively, long before the science of nutrition had developed to explain why, as foods that prevented the worst ravages of a diet dominated by salt meat and biscuit. They were rich in protein, rich in certain vitamins that salt meat and hardtack lacked entirely, and crucially, they were simple to prepare. You soaked them overnight in fresh water, then boiled them in a large pot with salt and whatever scraps of salt pork might be available, and you produced something called peas porridge, a thick, slightly gluey, uniformly beige soup that was warm, filling, and nutritionally superior to almost anything else a sailor was going to eat that day. The ships of the Royal Navy in the 17th and 18th centuries carried enough dried peas in their stores to serve peas porridge on specific days of the week, following a dietary schedule that was mandated by Admiralty regulation. The regulation existed not out of any particular concern for sailor welfare, but out of hard economic practicality. If you fed men peas on Wednesday and Friday, you could save the more expensive salt beef for other days, and the men would be marginally less likely to develop the vitamin deficiencies that made them unable to fight. This dietary schedule, what sailors ate on which days, in what quantities, was known as the establishment, and it was one of the most rigidly enforced aspects of shipboard life. The British Admiralty's victualling regulations specified, in precise and somewhat depressing detail, exactly what every man in the fleet was entitled to eat on every day of the week. On Monday, a man might receive 1 pound of salt beef, 1 pound of biscuit, and a pint of dried peas. On Tuesday, the beef would be replaced by salt pork. Wednesday would be peas porridge day. Thursday, salt beef would return. Friday, fish day. Saturday, pork. Sunday, more beef. The quantities were set not by any nutritional calculation but by custom, cost, and the practical limitation of what ships could actually carry. The result was a diet that was, by modern standards, horrifyingly deficient in fresh vegetables, fresh fruit, vitamin C, and almost everything else a modern nutritionist would consider essential to long-term health. The cook who presided over this monotonous and difficult provisioning task was, by the hierarchy of a sailing warship, not a particularly prestigious figure. The cook's station was the galley, which was a remarkably unpropitious location at the best of times. Directly above the waterline, in the forward part of the lower deck, which was the part of the ship most prone to flooding in rough weather, and which was typically shared with the anchor cable storage, meaning that wet hemp rope of spectacular pungency was a constant aromatic companion to the cooking. The equipment was a simple arrangement: a brick hearth or iron firebox, sometimes called the caboose, over which hung a large iron pot or several pots, plus a bread oven on larger ships. The heat was wood or charcoal, and the fire was one of the most tightly regulated elements of shipboard life, because fire on a wooden ship was not just inconvenient but catastrophic. The cook lit the galley fire at a specified time each morning and extinguished it at a specified time in the evening. No cooking happened between those hours unless the captain specifically authorized it. With this simple equipment, the cook, often a man who had been wounded or otherwise rendered unfit for active duty, and was thus assigned the relatively sedentary role of feeding the crew, was expected to transform barrels of salt pork, sacks of dried peas, 100 weights of ship's biscuit, and occasionally other provisions into 3 edible meals per day for several hundred men. The skill involved in this task was genuinely considerable, even if it received little recognition. A good ship's cook could take a barrel of salt beef that had been in brine for 6 months, soak it for 24 hours to draw out some of the excess salt, then boil it for hours until it was tender enough to eat, and combine it with peas and biscuit crumbled into the liquid to produce a filling and reasonably nourishing broth. A bad ship's cook would serve the same ingredients undersoaked and undercooked, producing something with the approximate texture of salted leather floating in a brine that tasted like the sea itself. The men ate in messes, small groups of 6 to 8 sailors who ate together, sharing the food that was brought from the galley to their designated spot at the long tables between the guns on the lower deck. The mess system had practical benefits beyond the purely social. It allowed the cook to prepare and distribute food in bulk rather than individually, and it created a small unit of accountability and mutual interest around food quality. If one man's mess was getting shortchanged on their ration, if the purser was skimming, or the cook was pilfering, the entire mess knew about it and could complain collectively. This social dimension of eating at sea was not trivial. In an environment of extreme physical discomfort, monotonous danger, and radical dislocation from everything familiar, the mess meal, even when the food was terrible, was one of the few structured social pleasures available to an ordinary sailor. Water was, in many ways, a more pressing problem than food. A man can survive considerably longer without food than without water, and the challenge of storing fresh water aboard a wooden ship was severe. Water was kept in large wooden casks in the hold, and over time, a few weeks in warm climates, it would develop a brownish colour, a thick smell, and a taste that modern observers consistently describe as foul in the extreme. Algae, bacteria, and various other microorganisms colonized the water as soon as it left the fresh spring or river where it had been loaded, and the wooden casks, no matter how thoroughly cleaned, provided an excellent habitat for microbial growth. The solution most navies eventually settled on was to mix the water with alcohol, specifically with small beer, a low-alcohol fermented drink that was resistant to contamination, or later with wine or spirits, which produced a mixture that was both safer to drink and presumably marginally more pleasant. The daily rum ration of the British Navy, a half-pint of neat rum later diluted with water to produce the drink known as grog, was not, in its origins, a simple reward for naval service. It was a practical solution to the problem of water preservation. Alcohol inhibits bacterial growth. A cask of water mixed with a proportion of rum or wine was less likely to become a health hazard than a cask of plain water stored in the same conditions. Sailors knew this intuitively, which is why they preferred their water mixed with spirits when they could get it, and naval administrators eventually accepted it because the arithmetic was simple. A sick sailor was an expensive sailor, and if rum rations kept more men on their feet, rum rations were cost-effective. But there were limits to how much any ship could carry. Water casks took up hold space, salt meat barrels took up hold space, sacks of dried peas took up hold space, and every cubic foot of the hold devoted to food and water was a cubic foot not available for ammunition, for trade goods, for equipment, for the other 10,000 things a ship required. The provisioning of a sailing warship was a constant balancing act between what was necessary for survival and what was necessary for the ship's mission, played out in the cramped arithmetic of a wooden hull that was never quite large enough for everything it was supposed to contain. This tension between what sailors needed to survive and what ships could reasonably carry came to its sharpest and most dramatic expression in the voyages of the great explorers. Because the explorers were not travelling between known ports, resupplying at familiar depots, sailing routes where the next harbour was always within 3 days' reach. They were sailing into the unknown across oceans that had no mapped coasts, for voyages that might last weeks or months, or, in the most extreme cases, years. For those men, the calculation of food and water was not a matter of administrative efficiency. It was a matter of life and death, worked out in meticulous and often desperate detail before the voyage began, and then abandoned to providence once the ships left port and the familiar land fell away behind them. In the late summer of 1519, 5 ships lay anchored in the harbour of Sanlúcar de Barrameda, at the mouth of the Guadalquivir River in southwestern Spain, preparing for a voyage that their captain-general, a Portuguese navigator named Ferdinand Magellan in the Spanish spelling, believed would take them around the southern tip of the American continent and across the vast unknown ocean beyond to the Spice Islands, the source of pepper and cloves and nutmeg that the European merchant class had been obsessing over for decades. Magellan's fleet carried 270 men. It would return, 3 years later, with 18. The reasons for this catastrophic attrition were multiple and complicated. A mutiny, hostile indigenous peoples in South America, a violent dispute with the Portuguese, disease, the simple mechanical failure of wooden ships subjected to 3 years of continuous sailing in the most extreme ocean conditions on Earth. But a significant portion of the deaths, perhaps the largest portion, though the historical record is incomplete, can be traced to hunger, to starvation, to malnutrition, and specifically to the disease of malnutrition that had been haunting sailors for centuries without anyone quite understanding what it was or where it came from. Magellan's purser, the officer responsible for managing the ship's provisions, was a careful man, and the loading records that survive from Sanlúcar de Barrameda give us a precise picture of what 5 ships and 270 men were expected to eat for a voyage of indeterminate length. The provisions included roughly 21,000 pounds of ship's biscuit, hundreds of gallons of olive oil and wine, significant quantities of salted fish and salt pork, dried beans, dried rice, honey, flour, garlic, anchovies, cheeses packed in wax to slow their deterioration, salt, raisins, about 2,100 pounds each of pork and beef, salted, and water in casks, supplemented by wine for the purpose already discussed of keeping the water potable longer than plain water would remain so. This was, by the standards of the time, a generous provisioning. The Spanish crown was not being stingy with Magellan. because the potential return on the voyage, control of the spice trade route, was almost incalculably valuable. But the provisioning was calculated for a voyage of 2 years at most, probably less, and the voyage took 3. And there was a fundamental problem with all of this careful loading, a problem that no amount of careful loading could solve. The voyage required crossing the Pacific Ocean, which Magellan believed to be much smaller than it actually was. When Magellan's 3 surviving ships, he had already lost 2 to the Atlantic portion of the voyage, entered the Pacific in November 1520, after the terrifying passage through the straits at the southern tip of South America that now bear his name, the food situation was already difficult. The Atlantic crossing and the months of coasting South America had consumed a large portion of the provisions. Magellan expected to cross the Pacific in weeks. It took 98 days, the record left by Antonio Pigafetta, an Italian nobleman who sailed with the expedition as an observer and who survived to write the most detailed account we have of the voyage, is one of the most harrowing food narratives in the history of exploration. Pigafetta described the food running out progressively during the Pacific crossing. First the dried meat, then the biscuit, then everything else. What was left as the weeks stretched into months without any sight of land was the barrels and the rigging and the hull itself. Sailors scraped the yellow worm-eaten sawdust from the bottom of the biscuit barrels and ate it. They chewed the ox-hide strips used to protect the rigging from the wear of the ropes. They ate rats, not reluctantly but eagerly, paying each other what little money they still possessed for the privilege of eating a rat that another man had caught. Pigafetta noted that rats were selling for half a ducat each by the time the fleet reached the Marianas Islands and found food again. The deaths during those 98 days were not primarily from outright starvation, though some men did starve. They were primarily from a disease that appeared first as weakness and fatigue, then progressed to swollen and bleeding gums, to loose teeth, to old wounds that inexplicably reopened and fresh bruises that appeared without any injury, to a profound and mysterious weakness of the entire body that ended eventually in death. We know this disease as scurvy, an almost total absence of vitamin C, which is essential for the production of collagen, the protein that holds human tissue together. But Magellan and Pigafetta and the dying sailors on those 3 ships did not know that. They only knew that men were dying, that the food they had brought from Spain was not preventing it, and that when they finally reached land and ate fresh fruit and vegetables, the disease disappeared almost overnight like a dream. The Pacific crossing experience was not unique to Magellan. It was a pattern that repeated itself throughout the Age of Discovery, on almost every long voyage into unknown waters, with the same grim regularity. Vasco da Gama, returning from his first voyage to India in 1499, lost half his crew to scurvy on the passage across the Indian Ocean, more men than had died to any other cause during the entire voyage to India and back. Columbus, on his 3rd voyage in 1498, had to put into port in Trinidad partly because his crews were in the early stages of scurvy, their gums swollen and bleeding, their energy failing. Francis Drake's circumnavigation in the 1570s was plagued by disease that modern historians believe was primarily scurvy, supplemented by other nutritional deficiencies, and in each case, the solution was the same: landfall, fresh food, recovery. And the lesson that one might expect to follow, that something in fresh food was necessary for health, something that was absent from salt meat and hardtack, was not learned. Not systematically, not officially, not in any way that changed how navies provisioned their ships. The reason for this failure of institutional learning is one of the more frustrating themes in the history of medicine and nutrition, and we'll return to it in detail when we reach the story of scurvy and its eventual official cure. But for now we stay with the provisioning problem during the Age of Discovery, and with the variety of solutions that different expeditions tried with varying degrees of success. One of the most important of these solutions was the practice of live provisioning, the carrying of live animals on board to be slaughtered as needed. This was not a new idea. It had been practiced on shorter voyages since antiquity, but the Discovery-era voyages elevated it to an art form. A large expedition ship of the 15th or 16th century might carry a small floating farmyard, pigs, chickens, goats, sheep, and sometimes cattle on larger vessels. The animals were kept on the upper deck or in cages between decks, fed with grain brought for the purpose, and slaughtered in a prescribed order as the voyage progressed, starting with the pigs and cattle, which consumed the most feed and ending with the chickens, which could be kept alive on scraps for the longest time. Fresh meat was the single most valuable food on a long voyage because it provided protein, fat, and a range of trace nutrients absent from preserved provisions, and it could be distributed to sick men as a form of dietary medicine long before the mechanism of that medicine was understood. Portuguese explorers, who pioneered the sea routes around Africa and to Asia in the late 15th century under the direction of Prince Henry the Dusty, Navigator and his successors, developed particularly sophisticated live provisioning techniques. The Portuguese caravels and naus that made the India run carried not just the standard farmyard animals but, uniquely, sea turtles. The green sea turtle, which was abundant in the tropical waters the Portuguese frequented, was a discovery of almost miraculous value from a naval provisioning perspective. A large green turtle could weigh several hundred pounds, providing a quantity of meat comparable to a small pig. Turtles required almost no maintenance on board ship. They could be simply turned upside down on the deck, where they would remain alive, relatively inactive for weeks, drawing on their own fat reserves for sustenance. They did not need to be fed or given water or tended in any particular way. They simply waited, patient and inert, until the cook was ready for them. And when slaughtered, they provided not just meat but fat and cartilage that were used as the basis for soup, and blood that was sometimes consumed directly as a nutritional supplement. The logistical advantage of the turtle was so significant that Portuguese naval practice included explicit instructions for capturing turtles at sea and keeping them for later consumption. The practice spread to the Spanish, British and Dutch navies as the Age of Discovery proceeded, and eventually contributed to the near extinction of several sea turtle species in the Caribbean and Pacific, as centuries of naval expeditions treated the islands and atolls of tropical seas as convenient live food depots. When Charles Darwin visited the Galapagos Islands in 1835 on HMS Beagle, he noted that British whalers and naval vessels had by that point been taking Galapagos tortoises, a somewhat different species from the sea turtles, but similarly valued for their ability to survive on board ship without food for months, for decades. He estimated that somewhere between 10 and 15,000 tortoises were being taken from the islands per year. This rate of exploitation was, as Darwin could already see, not sustainable, and several species of Galapagos tortoise were extinct or on the verge of extinction by the late 19th century, the direct consequence of being the perfect naval provision. Beyond live animals and the traditional salt provisions, Discovery-era expeditions also carried a variety of preserved fruits and vegetables that were specific to their home cultures and represented local solutions to the universal problem of preventing scurvy without knowing what scurvy was. Spanish ships, sailing from the ports of Andalusia, typically carried raisins and dried figs in significant quantities, both of which contain modest amounts of vitamin C, sufficient to slow the development of scurvy if consumed regularly, even if not enough to prevent it entirely in a crew eating no fresh food for months. Portuguese ships frequently carried a preserve made from quinces, a fruit in the quince family that was made into a stiff paste, membrillo in Spanish, known to the Portuguese as marmelada, from which the word marmalade is derived, that was both a luxury item and a practical provision with some modest anti-scorbutic properties. Dutch ships, drawing on the preserved food traditions of Northern Europe, carried barrels of sauerkraut, fermented cabbage, which, as we will discuss in a later part of this story, turned out to be one of the most effective anti-scorbutic provisions ever developed, though the Dutch did not know why it worked any more than anyone else did. And then there were the waters themselves. Every experienced navigator knew that certain anchorages and islands were good for watering, had clean, reliable springs, and others were not. Every experienced provisioning officer knew which markets in which ports sold provisions of acceptable quality, and which sold food that would rot in the hold within a week. This knowledge was guarded, carefully, and shared selectively. Portuguese navigators of the India Run developed a detailed oral and written tradition of portolans, route guides, that included not just navigational information but provisioning information: where to find fresh water, where to find fruit and vegetables, where to find live animals for purchase, where to avoid because the local food always made the crew sick. This accumulated practical wisdom was as valuable to a naval expedition as any chart or compass, and much harder to replace if it was lost. But knowledge, no matter how carefully accumulated, could not solve the fundamental problem that every Discovery-era expedition faced: the unknown voyage. If you were sailing to India by a known route, you could plan your provisioning precisely: water here, fruit there, a week's layover at this island for the crew to recover from the Atlantic crossing. If you were sailing into the Pacific Ocean for the first time with no charts, no previous experience, and no idea how large the ocean actually was, no amount of accumulated wisdom could help you. You loaded as much as you could carry. You prayed that it would be enough, and when it was not, men died in the way that Magellan's men died, and Drake's men died, and Da Gama's men died. Slowly, with bleeding gums and swollen joints, staring at the horizon for land that never came. The disease that killed them was scurvy, and the story of how it was eventually understood and eventually defeated, and of the decades it took for that defeat to be accepted, is the next chapter of our voyage tonight. The disease arrived quietly. That was one of the things that made it so insidious. It did not announce itself with sudden fever or dramatic collapse. It crept up on a man gradually over weeks, beginning with fatigue that was indistinguishable from the ordinary exhaustion of hard work at sea. A sailor would notice that he was tired more easily than usual, that his legs ached at the end of a watch in a way they had not ached a month before. He might put it down to the cold, or to the recent storm, or to the change in diet, or to any of the dozen other explanations that suggested themselves aboard a ship where discomfort was the constant baseline condition. He would keep working because you kept working on a sailing ship unless you physically could not stand, and the ship did not care about your tired legs. Then, a few weeks further in, the gums would begin. Not dramatically, not all at once, but with a gradual swelling and reddening, a tenderness that made eating the hard ship's biscuit, already a significant mechanical challenge, considerably more painful. Some men found their gums bleeding when they pressed on them, leaving a bright smear of blood on their fingers that they would stare at for a moment, perhaps with a sense of unease they could not quite articulate, before wiping it away and getting back to work. Others noticed that old scars, old healed wounds, from previous injuries, had begun to feel sore and strange, that the skin over them seemed somehow looser, less firmly attached to the flesh beneath. This was not imaginary. In a body depleted of vitamin C, collagen fibers, the protein scaffolding that holds scar tissue together, that binds wound edges and keeps repaired tissue functional, were literally disintegrating. Old healed wounds were not just reopening in the sense of becoming painful, they were structurally reverting, the scar tissue breaking down as the collagen that composed it lost its integrity. What followed, in cases that progressed to the middle and late stages of scurvy, was a sequence of symptoms that every ship's surgeon in the age of sail came to recognize with dread. The gums would become so swollen and spongy that they would cover the teeth, and the teeth would loosen in their sockets, and eventually a man might find himself able to push his own teeth back and forth with his tongue. Enormous bruises would appear spontaneously on the limbs, where blood was leaking from capillaries that had lost their structural integrity. The capillary walls, like everything else in the body, depended on collagen, and without collagen they were failing. Men in the late stages of scurvy would be covered in these spontaneous hemorrhages, great darkening patches of purple and black under the skin, and they would be so weak that they could barely lift their arms. Joint pain was extreme. The men of Magellan's Pacific crossing who survived long enough to reach the Marianas Islands reportedly had to be carried ashore, unable to walk, their bodies in an advanced state of collapse. The most haunting and medically mysterious aspect of scurvy, the one that ship surgeons of the 17th and 18th centuries found most baffling, was the phenomenon of old wound reopening. Surgeons would come across men whose bodies seemed to be reversing through time, old injuries from years or decades before, coming alive again, scars from sword cuts or accident injuries or even operations performed years earlier reopening and bleeding. There were accounts of sailors who had suffered broken bones years before developing scurvy, and who found, during the disease's progression, that the healed bones seemed to be failing at the point of the old fracture. One 18th century naval surgeon described a man whose entire medical history seemed to be replaying itself in reverse, each old wound emerging again in the order in which it had originally healed, as if the body were being unwound like a clock. This symptom alone, if we set aside all the others, would have been enough to inspire genuine terror, the sense that something fundamentally wrong and irreversible was happening. And yet, despite centuries of observation, despite the accumulated testimony of hundreds of ship's surgeons who had watched the disease progress through their crews and written careful accounts of what they saw. The cause of scurvy remained unknown until the 20th century, and the cure, which was well established by empirical observation by the mid-18th century, remained officially unaccepted and operationally unused by the British Navy until nearly the end of that same century, in one of the most frustrating episodes in the history of medicine. The empirical observation was this: that fresh food cured scurvy, that sailors who landed on a shore and ate fresh vegetables and fruit recovered from advanced scurvy with a speed that bordered on the miraculous. Men who had been unable to walk or speak were up and working within a week of eating fresh greens and citrus fruit. This had been noticed by virtually every navigator who had survived a long voyage in the Age of Discovery. Da Gama's surgeon noted it on the return from India in 1499. English sailors noted it on Drake's circumnavigation. Spanish navigators noticed it repeatedly during the Pacific crossings of the 16th and 17th centuries. The Dutch East India Company, by the early 17th century, had even established what may be the world's first explicitly anti-scorbutic provisioning station at the Cape of Good Hope, the settlement that would eventually become Cape Town, specifically to grow fresh vegetables for the fleets of the company passing to and from Asia. This was not based on scientific understanding. It was based on the simple observed fact that sailors who ate fresh vegetables at the Cape were sick less often than sailors who did not. What was lacking was not the observation. What was lacking was the explanation. Without an understanding of vitamins, without even the concept of specific dietary nutrients as distinct from general caloric content, observers in the 16th and 17th centuries could not explain why fresh food worked and salt provisions did not. The explanations they offered were various and ingenious and entirely wrong. Some physicians believed scurvy was caused by the dampness of the sea air, which entered the body through the lungs and corrupted the blood. Others believed it was caused by eating too much salt, which was plausible given that the diet of a sailor was overwhelmingly dominated by heavily salted food. Still others believed it was an excess of bile, or a weakness of the vital spirits, or a consequence of the specific astrological conditions prevailing in the Southern Ocean. These theories were not considered absurd by their contemporaries. They were perfectly consistent with the medical frameworks of their time, which had no concept of micronutrients and no mechanism by which a missing substance in food could cause a specific physiological failure. The first serious systematic attempt to investigate scurvy scientifically was made by a Scottish naval surgeon named James Lind, and his story is one of the most important and most frustrating in the history of medicine. James Lind was born in Edinburgh in 1716 and trained as a physician in the established tradition of Scottish medicine, which was at that time among the most rigorous in the world. He joined the Royal Navy as a ship's surgeon in 1739, at the beginning of the War of Austrian Succession, and served for several years in various postings before joining the crew of HMS Salisbury in 1747. It was aboard the Salisbury, on a voyage in the Eastern Atlantic, that Lind conducted what is now considered one of the earliest controlled clinical trials in the history of medicine. In May 1747, Lind had 12 patients with advanced scurvy, all of them in roughly similar condition, all of them receiving the same basic diet of water gruel, mutton broth and biscuit. He divided them into 6 pairs and gave each pair a different supplement in addition to their standard ration. One pair received 2 quarts of cider daily. One pair received 25 drops of vitriol of elixir 3 times a day. One pair received 2 spoonsful of vinegar 3 times a day. One pair received half a pint of seawater daily. One pair received 2 oranges and 1 lemon each day. And one pair received a paste of garlic, mustard seed, horseradish, balsam of Peru, and gum myrrh. Within 6 days, the pair receiving the oranges and lemon had recovered so dramatically that one of them was fit for duty, and the other was well enough to help nurse the remaining patients. None of the other pairs showed comparable improvement. This was a clear result. It was a controlled experiment. Lind had isolated the variable, citrus fruit, and demonstrated its efficacy with a degree of methodological rigour that was unusual for the medicine of his time. He published his findings in 1753 in a book called A Treatise of the Scurvy, and in that book he laid out his evidence clearly and argued explicitly that citrus fruit should be included in the standard provisioning of Royal Navy vessels. He recommended specifically that lemon juice, the most portable and storable form of citrus provision, be carried on all ships and administered preventively to crews showing the early signs of vitamin deficiency. The Royal Navy largely ignored him for 42 years. 42 years during which British naval expeditions continued to suffer devastating losses from scurvy. 42 years during which naval administrators looked at Lynd's evidence and found reasons not to implement his recommendation. The cost of lemon juice at scale was significant. The logistics of carrying it on long voyages were not trivial, and the medical establishment of the time was not yet prepared to abandon the bile and damp air theories in favour of something as counterintuitive as a specific substance in a specific fruit having a specific physiological effect. It did not help that Lynd himself was not the most aggressive advocate for his own work. He was, by temperament, a careful scientist, more comfortable in the library than in the lobbying offices of the Admiralty. What finally changed the Navy's position was not primarily scientific persuasion, but financial devastation. The 7 Years' War, which Britain fought against France and her allies from 1756 to 1763, produced naval casualties from scurvy on such a scale that the numbers became impossible to ignore. One analysis of the period concluded that the Royal Navy lost more men to scurvy during the 7 Years' War than to all enemy action combined: cannon fire, muskets, boarding actions, everything. An admiral named George Anson, who had led a famous circumnavigation in the 1740s, during which he lost nearly 2/3 of his men to scurvy and other diseases, became one of the most vocal advocates within the naval establishment for dietary reform, driven not by any particular scientific conviction, but by the simple experience of watching hundreds of men die on a voyage that should not have been that dangerous. Anson's circumnavigation is studied today not primarily for its naval achievements, but for the staggering human cost that scurvy extracted from it, documented in a narrative published in 1748 that became a bestseller in Britain and shocked the reading public with its account of men dying in their hammocks from a disease that everyone knew could be prevented by eating an orange. The formal adoption of lemon juice as a mandatory naval provision came in 1795, when the physician Gilbert Blaine, a man considerably more politically adept than Lynd, persuaded the Admiralty to order the daily issue of lemon juice to all Royal Navy crews. The results were almost immediate and almost miraculous. Hospital admissions for scurvy dropped by approximately 90% within the first year of the new policy. Ships that had previously been unable to complete long voyages without losing substantial portions of their crews to disease suddenly found themselves completing those same voyages with crews that remained healthy and functional. The timing was significant. The Napoleonics. Wars were beginning, and the Royal Navy's ability to maintain a continuous blockade of French ports, a strategy that depended on ships being able to remain at sea for months without returning to port, would not have been possible without a crew that could remain healthy for that duration. Lemon juice, in a very real sense, helped win the Napoleonic Wars. But the lemon juice story has one more famous twist, a mistake that became one of the most consequential errors in naval medical history. In the early 19th century, the Royal Navy began substituting West Indian lime juice for the Mediterranean lemon juice that Lynd and Blaine had recommended. The reason was economic and logistical. Britain controlled several lime-producing islands in the Caribbean, making British lime juice much cheaper and more readily available than imported Mediterranean lemon juice. The problem was that West Indian limes contained significantly less vitamin C than Mediterranean lemons, about a quarter of the amount in fact. And when the lime juice was additionally processed and stored in copper containers, which destroyed further vitamin C through oxidation, the resulting product had almost no antiscorbutic value at all. The consequences of this substitution were not immediate, because the Navy continued using the lemon juice standard in its calculations and protocols even after switching to limes, and no one had yet measured the vitamin C content of either fruit. But by the mid-19th century, with lime juice now universally used and universally believed to be adequate, British expeditions to the Arctic, where the cold, the darkness, and the complete absence of any fresh food made scurvy particularly dangerous, began losing men to the disease again, including on expeditions that had been carefully provisioned with lime juice according to the established protocol. The Franklin expedition of 1845, which disappeared entirely in the Canadian Arctic, suffered not just from scurvy but from a range of nutritional deficiencies that modern analysis of the expedition's records and the preserved remains of its sailors has helped to reconstruct. The lime juice they carried was effectively useless. The consequence of the lime substitution and of the false confidence it generated was that by the time the Royal Navy was conducting serious Arctic exploration in the second half of the 19th century, a disease that had been effectively conquered by the correct application of a dietary supplement had apparently returned. British polar explorers were contracting scurvy while carrying lime juice that they believed should be protecting them. The mystery deepened rather than resolved. It was not until the 1930s, when biochemist Albert Szent-Györgyi isolated ascorbic acid and identified it as the active component of the antiscorbutic foods, that the biological mechanism of scurvy was finally understood, and not until then that the error of the lime substitution was fully explained. The sailors' nickname for a British tar was already limey by that point, a term borrowed from the lime juice ration, and it stuck in the language long after the lime juice itself had been replaced by something more reliable. The scurvy story is, among other things, a story about the gap between empirical observation and institutional action, between what is known and what is believed, between a doctor's evidence and a bureaucracy's inertia. It is also, more quietly, a story about how difficult it is to change the way that millions of people eat, even when the evidence that the change is necessary is compelling and the cost of not changing is measured in human lives. Those dynamics, the institutional resistance to dietary reform, the gap between scientific knowledge and practical implementation, did not end with the Royal Navy's adoption of lemon juice. They persisted, in different forms, into every subsequent era. But in the context of naval history, the scurvy story marks a turning point. The moment when the feeding of sailors began to be understood not just as a logistical problem, but as a scientific one, with answers that could be discovered, tested, and applied systematically. It was a beginning, not an ending. There is a building in the south of England, in the naval town of Portsmouth, that most tourists pass without a second glance. It is a long, low brick structure, not particularly distinguished in appearance, that dates to the early 18th century and was known, in its working years, as the victualling yard. Inside this yard, and in its counterparts at Plymouth, at Deptford-on-the-Thames, and at the great overseas provisioning stations in Gibraltar, at Antigua, at Cape Town, and at Bombay, the machinery of naval feeding was assembled and maintained for 2 centuries. The victualling yards were the logistical foundation of British naval power, the places where the barrels were filled, the biscuits were baked, the beef was salted, the rum was measured, and everything was packed, labelled, inspected, and shipped out to the fleet. Without them, there was no fleet, and the story of how they came to exist and how they operated is one of the more remarkable administrative achievements of the early modern world. The problem that the British Navy faced by the late 17th century was one of pure scale. The wars of the age, the Anglo-Dutch Wars, the 9 Years' War, the War of Spanish Succession, were generating fleet requirements of a size that had no precedent in European history. At the peak of the War of Spanish Succession, the Royal Navy had more than 40,000 men at sea simultaneously, on hundreds of ships across the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the North Sea, and the English Channel. 40,000 men, each needing 4,000 calories per day, in an era before industrial food production, in a country where the agricultural and manufacturing infrastructure had never been designed to support anything on this scale. The response, developed somewhat haphazardly at first and then refined over several decades, was the creation of a specialised naval bureaucracy dedicated entirely to provisioning, the Navy Victualling Board. The Victualling Board was established formally in 1683, though its roots go back to earlier ad hoc provisioning arrangements, and it operated, with various reorganisations and occasional scandals, until it was absorbed into the broader Admiralty administrative structure in 1832. In its heyday, the Victualling Board employed thousands of people, managed millions of pounds of provisions annually, and operated what was effectively one of the largest food processing and distribution networks in the world. The biscuit was the Victualling Board's greatest logistical challenge, and the one it addressed most successfully. Baking ship's biscuit at the scale required by a large fleet was not simply a matter of scaling up a domestic recipe. It required purpose-built industrial facilities, the biscuit mills, which processed grain into the specific type of flour required, the baking halls, which contained multiple large ovens operating continuously, and the storage warehouses, which had to be kept dry and ventilated to prevent the finished biscuit from absorbing moisture and becoming unusable. The victualling yard at Portsmouth had a biscuit mill and bakery capable of producing more than 20,000 pounds of biscuit per day when operating at full capacity, a figure that seems almost impossible given the technology available, but which is supported by the detailed accounts kept by the victualling board's clerks and auditors. The biscuit manufacturing process at these facilities was largely mechanised by the early 19th century, which makes it something of a remarkable early example of industrial food production. A series of machines, rollers, cutters and conveyors, powered initially by horses walking in circles to turn a central shaft, and later by steam engines, could process grain into flour, mix flour into dough, roll dough into sheets, cut sheets into the standard square or round biscuit shape, punch the characteristic grid of holes and deliver the raw biscuits to the oven on a continuous belt. The ovens themselves were enormous, capable of handling hundreds of biscuits simultaneously, and they were operated by specialised bakers who had been trained specifically for this work. The finished biscuits were inspected, weighed, and packed in cloth bags or wooden boxes, then stored in the warehouse until needed. The beef and pork salting operations were equally impressive in scale, if considerably less pleasant to observe. The victualling yards maintained their own slaughterhouses, where cattle and pigs were killed and processed during the autumn, when animals were traditionally slaughtered before winter, partly because winter-killed animals were fatter and better flavoured than spring animals, and partly because the colder autumn temperatures slowed bacterial growth during the initial salting process, reducing spoilage. The carcasses were cut into pieces of a standardised weight, 4 pounds roughly, and packed in layers in large, wooden barrels with dry salt between each layer, then filled with saturated brine and sealed with a wooden bung. The barrels were then stored in cool, dark warehouses, labelled with their contents and the date of packing, and issued to ships in order of age, oldest first, on the sensible principle that salt provisions did not improve with time and should be used before they deteriorated further. The rum ration deserves its own chapter in this story, because the relationship between the Royal Navy and rum was one of the more complicated and important nutritional and social histories of the 18th century. Rum is a product of the Caribbean sugar industry. It is distilled from molasses, the byproduct of sugar refining, and it was available in enormous quantities and at very low cost from the British sugar colonies throughout the 18th century. When the British Navy established its Caribbean operations during the wars of the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the availability of local rum, much cheaper than the wine or beer that had previously been the standard sailors' drink, made it the obvious choice for the daily liquid ration. The standard daily rum ration in the 18th century Royal Navy was half a pint of neat rum, approximately 56.8 millilitres of alcohol at a strength of around 57% ABV, which modern standards would classify as a substantial daily dose of alcohol. The ration was issued twice a day in 2 portions, and was consumed on the spot under the supervision of an officer to prevent hoarding and trading. The practical purpose of the ration, beyond the morale function that everyone acknowledged, was the already mentioned one of water preservation. A proportion of rum mixed into the daily water ration made the water safer to drink, or at least more palatable, and the sailors who received the ration were demonstrably less likely to suffer from the waterborne gastrointestinal diseases that plagued armies and navies throughout history. The diluted version of the ration, rum mixed with water in a 2-to-1 water-to-rum ratio, was known as grog, a name derived from the nickname of Admiral Edward Vernon, who ordered the dilution in 1740 in response to concerns about drunkenness aboard the ships under his command. Vernon habitually wore a cloak made of grogram fabric, a coarse mixed cloth which had earned him the nickname Old Grog among his sailors. When he ordered the ration diluted, the sailors predictably named the resulting drink after him. The diluted grog was still a significant daily dose of alcohol, but it was considerably less than the undiluted half-pint had been, and Vernon's order was eventually adopted fleet-wide over the objections of sailors who had rather enjoyed the stronger ration. The man most directly responsible for the day-to-day operation of naval feeding at the ship level was the purser, an officer whose role was primarily financial and administrative, rather than culinary, but who exercised enormous practical control over what sailors actually ate. The purser was responsible for receiving the ship's provisions from the victualling yard, storing them correctly, issuing them to the cook in the correct quantities, keeping the accounts, and ensuring that the ship did not run short of any essential provision. He was also, in practice, one of the most significant potential vectors for fraud in the entire naval system. A purser who was willing to issue short rations to sell provisions on the side, or to falsify records could make a very comfortable income at the expense of the men under his nominal care. The phrase "purser's pound," referring to the practice of issuing 14 ounces rather than the correct 16 ounces as a pound of provisions, was so common in Royal Navy usage that it became standard practice, officially acknowledged, with the purser receiving the 2-ounce difference as a form of compensation for his administrative costs. This arrangement, which persisted in official regulations for decades, was one of the more remarkable examples of institutionalized food theft in the history of catering. The consequence of these pervasive minor frauds, the short rations, the substitutions of inferior provisions, the Weevilly biscuit that should have been condemned but was issued anyway because condemning it would reflect badly on the purser's accounts, was a constant low-level nutritional deficit that made sailors chronically less healthy than they should have been even in the absence of specific diseases like scurvy. Men who were receiving 90% of their nominal ration, and whose 90% was itself composed partly of provisions past their best, were already nutritionally compromised before any additional stressor, disease, hard weather, extended time at sea, pushed them further into deficit. The malnourishment was invisible, distributed across thousands of ships and hundreds of thousands of men over decades, but it was real, and it had real consequences for the fighting effectiveness of the fleet. Naval reformers of the late 18th and early 19th centuries understood this problem, even if they could not articulate it in the nutritional language that would become available later. The surgeon Gilbert Blaine, who had fought so hard for the adoption of lemon juice, was equally persistent in his advocacy for better provisioning standards generally. He argued, in terms that naval administrators could understand, that a well-fed sailor was cheaper than a sick sailor, that the cost of adequate provisions was less than the cost of sick lists, hospital admissions, the replacement of men who died from preventable disease, and the reduced fighting effectiveness of crews who were physically depleted. This argument, that nutrition was an investment rather than an expense, was the one that eventually persuaded the Admiralty, just as it eventually persuades most institutions when pressed hard enough. But it took time, and in the interval between the argument being made and the argument being accepted, men continued to eat what the system provided them, and the system was imperfect, and some of them died as a result. A man walking the upper deck of a large sailing warship in the mid-18th century, navigating carefully between the anchored ropes and the coils of cable that perpetually occupied every available horizontal surface, would have encountered a sound that no modern warship would ever produce, the sound of livestock. The clucking of chickens from coops lashed against the forward bulwark, the occasional grunt or squeal from the pig pen near the mainmast, the bleating of a goat kept by an officer for the luxury of fresh milk, tethered to a ring bolt near the gangway. And beneath the deck, in the spaces between the guns on the lower decks, or down in the orlop where the midshipman slept and the surgeon, operated the persistent and pervasive smell of animal that no amount of salt air could entirely dispel. The carrying of live animals on warships and merchant vessels was universal in the age of sail, and it persisted well into the 19th century. The animals served several purposes. They were a source of fresh meat when slaughtered, they were a source of fresh eggs and milk while alive, and they were, for the officers who kept personal animals, a small comfort of home in an environment where comfort was rare. The standard complement of livestock on a Royal Navy ship of the line in the 18th century might include 100 or more chickens, several pigs, a number of sheep, and possibly a few goats. Larger ships, or ships setting out on particularly long voyages, might carry considerably more. Records from the provisioning of ships sent on extended expeditions sometimes list cattle, calves, and more exotic species acquired during the voyage. The order in which animals were slaughtered was determined by a calculus of cost and practicality that every experienced provisioning officer understood intuitively. Cattle and pigs consumed the most feed and provided the most meat. They were slaughtered early in the voyage, when there were enough men aboard to consume the meat before it could spoil. Sheep were next, smaller and slower to be missed in the diminishing livestock count. Chickens and geese were kept longest, both because they produced eggs throughout the voyage and because they could be fed on scraps and insects, on the leavings from the galley, on the weevils knocked out of biscuit barrels, on anything that fell to the deck, with a dietary efficiency that larger animals could not match. A chicken could convert nearly worthless material into a fresh egg, and a fresh egg was, in the galley of a ship that had been at sea for 6 weeks, a luxury almost beyond price. The management of shipboard livestock was a specialised skill, and the men responsible for it, variously the cook, the boatswain, or in some cases a dedicated animal keeper, developed techniques for keeping animals alive and productive in the challenging conditions of a wooden ship at sea. The chickens were housed in coops designed to allow maximum ventilation while protecting the birds from rain and spray. The pigs were kept in pens that could be quickly secured in heavy weather. The larger animals, cattle and horses when carried, were sometimes suspended in slings to prevent them from injuring themselves when the ship rolled. Feed was a constant concern. The animals competed directly with the men for the grain in the ship's stores, and a long voyage with no opportunity to replenish feed could force the early slaughter of animals that would otherwise have been kept alive longer. Among the most valuable provisions any Discovery era or early modern expedition could acquire during its voyage were the sea turtles of the tropical Atlantic and Pacific and the tortoises of the oceanic islands. We touched on the green sea turtle's virtues earlier, but the full picture of how comprehensively these animals were exploited by naval and commercial vessels deserves more attention. The green sea turtle, Chelonium idus, was found throughout the tropical and subtropical Atlantic and Pacific, and was particularly abundant in the waters around the Caribbean islands, the mid-Atlantic islands of Ascension and St. Helena, the Galapagos archipelago, and the islands of the Pacific. Its virtues as a naval provision were almost comically perfect. It was enormous, providing hundreds of pounds of meat from a single animal. It was docile, making it easy to capture and handle. It could be kept alive on the ship's deck for weeks without any food or water, surviving on its own fat reserves, meaning it required no investment of the ship's provisions during its time aboard. And when slaughtered, it provided not just meat, but rich fat, suitable for cooking, cartilage that could be made into a gelatinous soup, and blood that was sometimes consumed as a restorative by sick men. The great navigators of the 16th and 17th centuries built the return legs of their Pacific and Atlantic voyages partly around known turtle grounds, places where sea turtles could reliably be found in large numbers, usually during the nesting season when females came ashore to lay eggs. The island of Ascension, in the middle of the South Atlantic, was one of the most important of these turtle grounds. A small, barren volcanic island with no permanent human population, but enormous numbers of nesting green sea turtles, which could be collected with minimal effort by sailors simply walking along the beaches at night and turning the nesting females upside down. Ships on the East India Run made deliberate detours to Ascension for turtles, and the records of the British East India Company's provisioning operations through the 17th and 18th centuries include regular entries for turtle collections at Ascension, St. Helena, and the Cape Verde Islands. St. Helena, the small island in the South Atlantic that Napoleon would eventually make famous as his final place of exile, had been established as a provisioning station by the Portuguese in the early 16th century, precisely because of its strategic location and its turtle populations. The Portuguese, with their characteristically methodical approach to the logistics of the India Run, planted fruit trees and vegetables on the island, released goats and pigs to breed freely and provide a supply of live animals for ships calling in, and maintained the turtle ground as a managed resource. By the time the British East India Company took control of the island in the mid-17th century, St. Helena had been transformed, over 150 years of Portuguese management, into a functioning provisioning garden, a small island that grew food specifically to feed passing ships. This concept, the deliberate cultivation of a provisioning resource at a strategic point on a major shipping route, was one of the most important naval logistical innovations of the Age of Discovery. The Portuguese applied it systematically throughout their oceanic empire, at São Tomé and Príncipe in the Gulf of Guinea, at the Azores in the mid-Atlantic, at the Cape Verde Islands, at Mozambique on the East African coast, at Goa on the Indian coast, and at a series of smaller islands and anchorages along the India Run. Each station was provisioned not just with stores brought from Portugal, but with locally growing food, fruit trees, vegetable gardens, cattle and goats, fish traps, turtle grounds. The result was a network of living pantries distributed across the oceanic world, each one maintained at significant cost and effort, each one saving the lives of sailors who would otherwise have arrived at their destination already weakened by months of inadequate diet. The British adopted and extended this model as their own oceanic empire developed. Gibraltar was not just a strategic military fortress, it was a victualling station, with extensive warehouses and gardens managed specifically to support the Mediterranean fleet. Jamaica was a victualling station as much as a sugar colony. The Cape Colony at the southern tip of Africa, which the British took from the Dutch during the Napoleonic Wars and retained permanently, was valued partly for its strategic location controlling the sea route to India and partly for its agricultural productivity. It produced grain, wine, beef, and vegetables in quantities sufficient to supply significant portions of the passing fleet. When British naval administrators made the argument for retaining the Cape Colony in the peace negotiations of the early 19th century, one of their arguments was explicitly about food, that the Cape was, in their phrasing, indispensable to the health of the Navy's eastern operations. The live cargo tradition persisted on British naval vessels until surprisingly late. Photographic records from the late 19th century show livestock pens on the upper decks of major warships, and the practice of carrying chickens for fresh eggs continued on some vessels into the early 20th century. The gradual displacement of live cargo by canned provisions, which we will reach in a later chapter, was a process that took decades, and in the interim there was a long period during which ship's cooks were managing both live animals and tins of preserved food simultaneously, the former for the benefit of the officers who expected fresh meat, the latter for the men who had less choice. The division between officer and sailor in naval food, officers eating fresh and varied, sailors eating preserved and uniform, was one of the most durable social distinctions of the age of sail, and it too persisted long after the technological changes that might have eliminated it. In 1768, the British Admiralty gave James Cook command of His Majesty's bark Endeavour and sent him south toward the unknown Pacific, with instructions to observe the transit of Venus from Tahiti, and then to search for the fabled southern continent that geographers had been arguing about for centuries. Cook was 40 years old, an experienced and methodical navigator from a Yorkshire farming background, and he brought to the command of Endeavour the same systematic practicality that characterised everything he did. Before leaving England, he spent considerable time supervising the provisioning of the ship, not just with the standard Admiralty rations, but with a series of experimental anti-scorbutic provisions that he intended to test on the voyage as a contribution to the long-standing debate about how to prevent scurvy. Among the provisions he loaded, against some resistance from the Admiralty, which was sceptical of novel provisioning, were multiple barrels of sauerkraut, fermented cabbage, prepared in the German and Dutch tradition of packing shredded raw cabbage in salt and allowing it to ferment in its own juice for several weeks. Cook had encountered the Dutch East India Company's practice of carrying sauerkraut on long voyages and had become convinced that it was more effective than the various other anti-scorbutics then in use by the Navy. He loaded the Endeavour with enough sauerkraut to provide each man with a regular ration for the duration of the voyage, which was expected to last 2 years. The problem Cook immediately encountered was one that anyone who has tried to introduce an unfamiliar food to a sceptical audience will recognise. His sailors refused to eat the sauerkraut, not because it was genuinely repulsive — sauerkraut is, by the standards of what these men ate every day, a reasonably edible food — but because it was unfamiliar, and sailors, like most people, were conservative about food, especially food with a sharp fermented smell that was unlike anything in the standard naval diet. Cook dealt with this resistance with a characteristically practical piece of psychological management. He ordered the sauerkraut served first at the officers' table only, making it visibly a privilege rather than an obligation. Within days, he reported, the sailors were demanding their share of a food they had previously refused to touch. Exclusivity had accomplished what direct ordering could not. The sauerkraut performed exactly as Cook had hoped. The Endeavour completed a voyage of nearly 3 years, through the Pacific, around New Zealand and Australia, back through the Indian Ocean, and around the Cape of Good Hope, with one of the lowest scurvy rates of any comparable voyage in the age of sail. When Cook reported this result, the Navy was interested but not immediately persuaded to change its provisioning, partly because the mechanism of sauerkraut's efficacy was no better understood than that of citrus fruit, and partly because the scale of producing and storing enough sauerkraut for the entire fleet was daunting. But Cook's second and third voyages reinforced the finding, and his published accounts of the dietary regimen he used, which included not just sauerkraut but maltwort, portable soup, and other experimental provisions, influenced a generation of naval officers and physicians who were trying to solve the scurvy problem. What Cook did not know, and could not know, was that sauerkraut's effectiveness against scurvy came from its vitamin C content. Fresh cabbage is a reasonably good source of vitamin C. When cabbage is fermented, most of the vitamin C is preserved. Fermentation does not destroy ascorbic acid the way that heating does, and the fermented product consequently retains much of the antiscorbutic value of the original vegetable. At the same time, the lactic acid produced during fermentation gives the sauerkraut its characteristic sour taste and also acts as a preservative, creating an acidic environment hostile to many spoilage organisms. This was the key insight that took until the 20th century to articulate scientifically, but that cooks and provisioners had arrived at empirically through centuries of practice. Fermentation preserved food, and the fermented foods happened to preserve certain nutrients that were essential to human health, and the provision of these foods on long voyages consequently preserved human life. Fermentation was not, of course, limited to sauerkraut in the history of naval provisioning. It was one of the oldest and most universal food preservation techniques in human history, predating salt curing by who knows how long, and present in virtually every food culture on Earth in some form. For navies specifically, fermented foods appeared in three main categories: fermented beverages, fermented vegetables, and fermented dairy products, each serving a slightly different function in the overall provisioning system. Fermented beverages, beer, wine, and spirits, have already appeared in our story as a solution to the water quality problem, but their role was more than just making water safe to drink. Small beer, the low-alcohol, lightly fermented barley drink that was the standard British sailors' daily beverage before rum became dominant, provided a small amount of B vitamins from the yeast involved in the fermentation process, supplementing the B vitamin content of the diet at a time when the diet was otherwise poor in this regard. Beer also provided modest amounts of carbohydrates and some trace minerals. These contributions were nutritionally marginal. Small beer was not a health food by any stretch of the imagination, but in a diet already so deficient as a naval sailor's, marginal contributions were not meaningless. Fermented vegetables beyond sauerkraut appeared in the provisioning of various navies based on their national food traditions. The Dutch, drawing on northern European fermentation traditions, carried pickled herring, soused in vinegar and brine, as a standard provision, and pickled vegetables of various kinds were common in Dutch naval stores throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. The Japanese, developing their own naval tradition in the 19th century, drew on centuries of experience with pickled and fermented foods, tsukemono, to provision their ships with fermented vegetable products that served a similar antiscorbutic function to sauerkraut, though the specific products and techniques differed. The Vikings had used fermented fish, the notorious surströmming and related products, both as a provision and as a flavour enhancement to the bland dried cod that was their dietary staple. Vinegar deserves particular attention because its role in naval food preservation was more complex and more important than its current culinary status as a salad dressing ingredient might suggest. Vinegar, dilute acetic acid, produced by the further fermentation of alcoholic beverages, was used aboard ships primarily as a preservative and as a flavouring for the otherwise monotonous salt rations. But naval surgeons from the 16th century onward had noted that ships that used vinegar liberally in their provisioning seemed to have lower rates of certain diseases than ships that did not. The Royal Navy's established rations included a regular allowance of vinegar from at least the early 17th century, and the victualling yard specifications for naval vinegar were precise and demanding. It had to meet a certain minimum acidity, be clear and free of sediment, and have a specific flavour profile that indicated proper fermentation. Part of vinegar's utility was straightforwardly antimicrobial. The acetic acid it contains is lethal to many bacteria and fungi, and washing food preparation surfaces, eating utensils and water casks with vinegar genuinely reduced the bacterial load in those objects, reducing the rate of gastrointestinal illness that was a constant plague of shipboard life. Part of its utility was preservative in a more direct sense. Vegetables pickled in vinegar, onions, cucumbers, cabbage, and various root vegetables, could be kept for months, and the acidity of the vinegar preserved most of their vitamin C content rather than destroying it, making pickled vegetables one of the more effective antiscorbutic provisions that navies could carry without knowing that is what they were doing. Onions in particular appear repeatedly in the provisioning records of long-distance voyages with a frequency that suggests experienced provisioners understood intuitively that they did something useful. We know now that onions contain quercetin and moderate amounts of vitamin C, both of which would have contributed to preventing scurvy. In the 18th century, what was known was simply that ships that carried onions regularly seemed to have fewer men sick. This kind of empirical correlation, you can't explain it, but you've seen it enough times to believe it, drove many of the most practical and effective innovations in naval provisioning, long before the science to explain them existed. The world of fermentation and preservation that these sailors and provisioners were navigating was vast and various, and still, in many respects, empirically driven, rather than scientifically understood. Every navy had its characteristic preserved foods, reflecting the culinary traditions of its home country and the particular resources available in its colonial empire. Every long voyage generated its own informal body of knowledge about what worked and what did not, accumulated in logbooks and surgeons' journals and the personal letters of officers who had survived to recommend specific provisions to the colleagues who would make the next voyage. And underneath all of it, invisible and unnamed, the biochemistry of fermentation was quietly doing what it had always done, transforming raw food into preserved food, maintaining the chemical structures that kept human bodies alive, and giving sailors one more tool in the endless, exhausting, endlessly creative struggle to stay alive at sea. It was into this world of accumulated empirical knowledge, of salt and fermentation, of live cargo and dried provisions, of lemons and limes and the hard-won lessons of disaster, that the first industrial revolution arrived, bringing with it a technology that would, within a generation, change the naval food supply more thoroughly than anything that had come before. It arrived not from the sea, and not from a navy, but from a kitchen in Paris, where a confectioner named Nicolas Appert was spending his evenings boiling glass jars and wondering why the food inside them stayed fresh. Nicolas Appert was born in 1749 in the small town of Chalon-sur-Marne, in the Champagne region of France, the son of an innkeeper. He grew up working in the inn, a childhood spent around food, around the preparation and preservation of food, around the practical questions that every innkeeper's family faced. How do you keep food through the winter? How do you make the harvest last until the next harvest? How do you feed people consistently when the supply of fresh ingredients is seasonal and unreliable? These were not philosophical questions for young Nicolas Appert. They were practical ones, and he spent his entire adult life answering them. By the time he was middle-aged, Appert had worked in champagne production, in commercial brewing, as a chef, as a confectioner, and had eventually established a confectionery shop in Paris. He was, by all accounts, a thoughtful and methodical man who approached the problems of food preservation with the systematic curiosity of someone who had been thinking about them since childhood. At some point in the 1790s, the exact date is uncertain, but it was during the period of the French Revolutionary Wars, when France was militarily mobilized, and the question of feeding armies and fleets was a matter of acute national concern. Appert began what he later described as 15 years of continuous experiment aimed at a single goal: finding a way to preserve food in sealed containers so that it would remain edible for months or years. The basis of Appert's idea was this: that food sealed in a container before heating, and then kept sealed throughout the heating process, would remain preserved indefinitely once cooled. He did not know why this was true. He had no concept of bacteria or of the microbial processes of decomposition. Louis Pasteur, who would eventually explain the biology of fermentation and spoilage, was not born until 1822, 40 years after Appert began his experiments. What Appert was working from was pure, empirical observation. He noticed that food heated in sealed containers did not seem to spoil as quickly as food heated in open pots. He spent 15 years refining this observation into a reliable technique. The containers he worked with initially were glass bottles, the kind used for champagne, which he knew well from his early career. He would fill the bottles with food, broths, vegetables, fruit, meat, whole dishes. He would cork the bottles firmly, bind the corks with wire, then place the sealed bottles in a large pot of boiling water for varying amounts of time. After heating, he would let the bottles cool, then store them and observe the results. Many early experiments failed. The bottles cracked from thermal stress, the seals leaked, the food spoiled despite his precautions. But gradually, through systematic variation and careful observation, he refined his technique. He learned the correct heating times for different types of food. He learned how to prepare the containers to withstand the thermal process. He learned the critical importance of ensuring a complete seal before heating. By 1803, Appert was confident enough in his results to contact the French Ministry of Marine, the Naval Ministry, and offer to demonstrate his technique. The French Navy, like every navy of the era, was struggling with the provisioning problem, and the ministry arranged for Appert to conduct a sea trial. 12 assorted jars of preserved food prepared by his method were placed aboard a naval vessel and subjected to a 4-month voyage. When the vessel returned, the jars were opened and examined. The results were, by the standards of what was possible at the time, remarkable. The food inside was largely intact, palatable, and safe to eat. The beans and peas were tender and tasty. The broth was fresh-smelling. The beef was wholesome. The French government's response was characteristically pragmatic. Napoleon Bonaparte, then at the height of his military power, had made it a matter of state policy to solve the problem of feeding armies and navies on extended campaigns. The famous aphorism attributed to Napoleon, that an army marches on its stomach, is probably not actually his, but it accurately reflects the strategic priority he placed on logistics, and specifically on food logistics. In 1810, the French government awarded Nicolas Appert the prize of 12,000 francs that it had been offering for more than a decade for a practical solution to the food preservation problem. The prize was established not primarily for naval use, but for the army, which faced the same provisioning challenges as the navy: the inability to keep food fresh in warm climates, the dependence on local foraging that made armies vulnerable and brutal, the logistical tail that determined how far from a supply base an army could operate. Appert published a book in 1810, the same year he received the prize, describing his method in detail. L'art de conserver les substances animales et végétales, the art of preserving animal and vegetable substances, was a practical manual, not a theoretical treatise, and it described the techniques Appert had developed with the precision and clarity of an experienced craftsman. He recommended glass bottles with wide mouths, sealed with corks reinforced with lime putty, and wire, heated in boiling water for times that varied by the type of food being preserved. The book was translated into English, German, and other languages within a year of publication, and its influence was immediate. The British response to Appert's work involved one of history's more amusing pieces of commercial espionage. A British merchant named Peter Durand, who may have been working for a French contact or may simply have been paying close attention to French publications, filed a patent in England in 1810, the same year as Appert's book, for a method of preserving food in sealed containers. Durand's patent described Appert's process but specified tin plate containers, cans, rather than glass bottles, and this substitution turned out to be the key innovation that transformed the process from a laboratory curiosity into an industrial food preservation technology. Glass bottles were fragile, heavy, and difficult to manufacture consistently. Tin cans were durable, relatively light, and capable of being produced in large quantities by metal workers who were already experienced with working sheet tin. Durand sold his patent to a pair of London merchants, Brian Donkin and John Hall, who established the world's first commercial canning factory in Bermondsey, South London, in 1813. By 1814, Donkin and Hall's factory was producing canned food in quantities sufficient to supply the British military, and the firm had begun submitting samples of its products to various naval and military authorities for evaluation. The Duke of Wellington, the greatest British military commander of the era, is reported to have tasted some of the early Donkin and Hall canned produce and pronounced it most excellent. More importantly, the British Admiralty placed orders. The early tin cans were nothing like the modern cans we use today. They were made by hand, each one individually soldered shut by a skilled tinsmith, and they were enormous by modern standards. A single can might contain 6 pounds or more of food, because smaller cans required more solder and more labour per unit of food. The opening of a can was not accomplished by a modern can opener, which did not exist. It required a hammer and chisel, or a special heavy-duty puncturing tool, and the instruction on early cans noted that buyers should cut round the top near the outer edge with a chisel and hammer. This is not, by any standard, a convenient serving solution. But it worked, and the food inside was safe, and that was what mattered. The limitations of the early canning process were significant, and they led to one of the most dramatic food safety scandals in naval history. The Admiralty, seeking to increase the quantity of canned provisions available to the Navy, contracted with a manufacturer named Stephen Goldner to supply large quantities of canned meat for the fleet. Goldner, facing pressure to deliver enormous quantities at low cost, cut corners on both materials and process. He used cans far larger than those originally specified. Some of his cans contained up to 9 pounds of meat, and he did not heat them sufficiently to sterilize the contents throughout. Large cans require significantly longer heating times than small ones, because heat must penetrate to the centre of the can from the outside, and in a 9-pound can of dense meat, the centre might remain at a temperature insufficient to kill bacteria, even when the exterior was adequately heated. The result of Goldner's corner cutting was not immediately apparent, because the canned provisions were intended for long-term storage and were distributed to the fleet and to polar expedition ships over several years. But when the cans were opened, sometimes years after packing, the food inside was frequently rotten, putrid in ways that horrified the men who opened them. A Royal Navy inquiry in the late 1840s revealed that large quantities of Goldner's canned provisions were contaminated, and the scandal contributed to the suspension of several naval contracts. More ominously, the Franklin expedition, the disastrous British attempt to navigate the Northwest Passage that departed in 1845 and vanished, was provisioned partly with Goldner's canned meat, and modern forensic analysis of the preserved remains of Franklin expedition crew members has found elevated levels of lead in their bones, consistent with lead solder from poorly made cans leaching into the food. The contribution of lead poisoning, on top of scurvy and the rigours of Arctic exploration, to the expedition's catastrophic outcome is still a subject of active historical debate. Despite these early failures, the direction was clear. Canning worked when done correctly. It provided a shelf life measured in years rather than months. It preserved a range of foods, vegetables, fruit, meat, fish, soup, that had never previously been available to sailors in preserved form. And as manufacturing processes improved, as tin cans became smaller and more consistently produced, as the heating process became better understood and more reliably executed, the quality of canned provisions rose steadily. By the 1860s and 1870s, canning was a well-established industry on both sides of the Atlantic, producing food for naval and military use but also increasingly for the civilian market, where the same preservation advantages that made it valuable for ships, long shelf life, ease of storage, no need for refrigeration, made it attractive to a rapidly urbanizing population that could not easily access fresh food daily. The tin can, born in a naval provisioning crisis, became one of the foundational technologies of modern food retail. Nicholas Appert died in 1841 in poverty. Despite the prize money, despite his fame as the inventor of the canning process, he had been unable to profit commercially from his own invention, partly through bad luck and partly through the characteristic inability of inventors to translate technical success into business success. He spent his last decade still experimenting, still trying to refine his process, living in a small house near his factory with an old woman who kept house for him, and a shelf of glass jars that he tended with the devotion of a gardener tending his plants. He had changed the way the world fed itself, and he died without knowing how profoundly. There is a village in Norway called Henningsvær, perched on the rocky islands of the Lofoten archipelago, above the Arctic Circle, where the winter wind comes off the sea with a bite that has never been quite captured in any language except the languages of the people who grew up in it. In January and February, the cod come south from the Barents Sea to spawn in the warmer coastal waters, and have been coming for as long as anyone has lived in this part of the world. For 1,000 years, the fishermen of Lofoten have hung the cod on wooden racks, simple frames of horizontal poles set on the hillsides where the wind is strongest, and left them there for months, until the fish is so desiccated that it is nearly as hard as wood and can be stacked like lumber, and will last for years without salt, without refrigeration, without any other treatment. This is stockfish, dried cod, the provision that fed the Viking expansion, and the medieval herring trade, and the Basque cod fisheries of the North Atlantic, and eventually the navies of half of Europe. Stockfish represents one end of a spectrum of drying techniques that were used to preserve food for navies long before salt curing became universal. The principle is simple. Remove enough moisture from a food, and the bacteria and fungi that cause spoilage cannot survive in it. The specific drying methods range from the pure cold air drying of Lofoten stockfish to the sun drying of fish and meat practiced throughout the Mediterranean and tropical worlds, to the more controlled hot air drying of various preserved meats and vegetables that navies developed as ancillary provisions to their primary salt meat rations. Smoking is a related but distinct preservation technique, and one with a longer naval history than is sometimes recognised. Wood smoke does not preserve food primarily by removing moisture, though it does remove some. It preserves by depositing on the food surface a complex mixture of chemicals, phenols, aldehydes, organic acids, that are antimicrobial, and that penetrate into the food tissues over time. The smoked fish and smoked meats of the British Isles, kippers, smoked herring, smoked haddock, smoked salmon were all commercially produced in large enough quantities by the 18th century to appear as occasional provisions on naval ships, particularly on shorter voyages or as officers' provisions. Smoked meats, particularly smoked hams and smoked bacon, were staple provisions on merchant vessels operating in the Atlantic trade. The preservative effect of smoke was empirically well understood long before the chemistry was known. Fishermen who'd been smoking their catch for generations knew exactly what colour the fish needed to be, exactly how long it needed to stay in the smokehouse, exactly what kind of wood produced the best and longest-lasting product. This knowledge was transmitted as craft knowledge, from parent to child, from master to apprentice, and it was extraordinarily refined and precise, even though the people who held it could not have articulated the chemistry of phenolic compounds or the mechanism of bacterial inhibition. Beyond salt and smoke and drying, there was a range of other preservation techniques that appeared in naval provisioning records with varying frequency. Sugar, used in high concentrations, has the same osmotic effect on food as salt. It draws out moisture and creates an environment hostile to microbial growth. And this is why heavily sugared preserves, jams, and fruit and syrup can last for months or years without refrigeration. Naval provisioning records occasionally mention preserved fruits in sugar, quinces, plums, apricots, particularly in the provisions of officers and for use in the treatment of sick sailors, for whom the sweet and acidic fruit was both a comfort and a source of vitamins. The East India Company ships sailing to and from a subcontinent famous for its preserved fruits often carried substantial quantities of Indian fruit preserves in their officers' stores, and these preserves, richer in vitamin C than many other officer provisions, probably contributed to the relatively low scurvy rates on well-provisioned company ships compared to Royal Navy vessels operating in the same waters. Honey, which has been known for its preservative properties for thousands of years, appears in the provisioning of ancient Mediterranean navies with some regularity, used both as a food and as a medium for preserving other foods. Greek and Roman sources describe meat preserved in honey, a technique that sounds improbable but actually works, because honey's high sugar content and low water content inhibit bacterial growth, and the natural hydrogen peroxide present in honey provides additional antimicrobial activity. The technique was not practical at naval scale. Honey was expensive and the quantities required to preserve significant amounts of meat were prohibitive, but it appears often enough in the sources to suggest that it was genuinely used, probably for the preservation of high-value foods like game birds and certain delicacies that officers brought aboard as personal provisions. Wax sealing, coating food in a layer of beeswax to exclude air and moisture, was used for certain types of cheese and preserved sausages that appeared in officers' provisions. A properly wax-sealed hard cheese could survive a long voyage without significant deterioration, and hard cheeses, Parmesan, Gouda, English cheddar, were regularly listed in the provisions of officers and sometimes of the better provisioned naval expeditions. Cheese provided fat, protein and calcium, all of which were in short supply in the standard sailor's diet, and a ship that carried cheese was, nutritionally speaking, somewhat better off than a ship that did not. The spice trade, which was one of the primary economic drivers of the Age of Discovery, was also indirectly a naval provisioning story. Black pepper, cloves, nutmeg, mace, and cinnamon were all used in the preservation of food, pepper in particular as an antimicrobial agent, cloves and cinnamon as mold inhibitors, as well as in the flavouring of preserved foods. The heavily peppered and spiced preserved meats of the medieval and early modern period were not, as is sometimes claimed, designed to mask the smell of rotten meat. A man who ate genuinely rotten meat would simply die, regardless of how much pepper was on it, and the cooks of the era knew this. The spices were used because they worked, empirically, to slow spoilage and to improve the flavour of food that had been preserved by other means. A salt barrel of pork that was also packed with dried herbs, pepper, and a little vinegar would last longer and taste better than a barrel with salt alone. And the men who packed the barrels knew this from experience even if they could not have said why. The cumulative effect of all these techniques — salt, smoke, drying, fermentation, sugar, honey, wax, spices — was a food supply that was, by the standards of pre-refrigeration technology, remarkably varied and remarkably effective. Not comfortable, not pleasant, often monotonous and frequently borderline unsafe, but functional, capable of keeping large numbers of men alive and working for months at a time, thousands of miles from any fresh supply. The ingenuity that went into developing and refining these techniques over thousands of years across dozens of cultures represents one of the most sustained and creative examples of applied human problem-solving in history. It was problem-solving driven by necessity. The alternative to solving the provisioning problem was death, and over the centuries death was the fate of many who failed to solve it well enough. But it was problem-solving nonetheless, and its results shaped not just naval history, but the entire history of food preservation, cooking, and the modern food industry. It is one thing to describe the systems and the strategies and the innovations of naval provisioning in the abstract. It is another to come down to the deck level, to sit in the mess with 8 men and their shared bucket of peas porridge, to feel the motion of the ship, to smell the mingled odours of the lower deck, and try to understand what a sailor's relationship with food actually was day to day through the long months at sea. Let us construct a day. A specific day, late in the 18th century, on a Royal Navy frigate somewhere in the North Atlantic in late autumn. The ship has been at sea for 6 weeks. The provisions were loaded fresh from Portsmouth, but the fresh provisions, the live chickens, the barrel of fresh vegetables, the eggs and butter, purchased at the last possible moment before departure, are mostly gone. What remains is the standard Admiralty ration: salt beef and salt pork in their barrels, sacks of dried peas and dried oatmeal, 100 weights of ship's biscuit, barrels of vinegar and oatmeal, a store of dried suet for making puddings on Sunday, and the daily rum ration. A sailor's day at sea in this era begins before dawn. The ship runs on a watch system that divides the crew into 2 halves, each standing 4 hours of watch and 4 hours of rest around the clock. At approximately 4 in the morning, the watch coming off duty is entitled to breakfast. The cook has been up since 3, carefully managing the temperamental galley fire. Today's fire, like yesterday's and every day's, must be hot enough to boil water in the large iron coppers, but must under no circumstances be allowed to spread beyond the firebox, because fire at sea is the one thing every sailor fears more than the enemy. Breakfast today is burgoo, a thick oatmeal porridge made by boiling dried oats in water with a small amount of salt and perhaps a small scraping of butter if the butter ration is not yet exhausted. The oats were pre-soaked overnight in a bucket of fresh water by the mess cook, the man whose turn it is this week to collect and distribute the rations for his mess of 8. The resulting porridge is grey, dense and largely flavourless. It is served in a large wooden bowl that the mess shares, each man scooping his portion with a wooden spoon, eating quickly because the bowls need to be rinsed and the men need to be back on deck. With the burgoo comes the daily biscuit, £1 per man, per day, as specified by Admiralty regulation, the standard 14-ounce purser's pound issued at the start of the day and expected to serve as the bread ration for all meals. The biscuit is tapped on the table, a few small shapes tumble out, nobody comments on them, everybody eats. The morning watch passes, 4 hours of rope hauling, canvas management, bilge pumping, lookout duty, and the 1,000 small tasks that keep a wooden ship operational on a grey North Atlantic day, when the wind is moderate and the sea is long and rolling. At noon, after the captain has taken his solar observation and confirmed the ship's position, the cook begins the main meal of the day, which, this Wednesday, is peas porridge. The dried peas that were set to soak before dawn have softened enough to cook. They go into the copper with the designated water, with a piece of salt pork that has been assigned as the flavouring meat. A piece soaked for 24 hours in several changes of fresh water to remove some of the overwhelming brine, though not nearly enough of it, and with salt and a splash of the daily vinegar ration. The copper simmers for 2 hours while the morning watch continues, and by the time the mess assembles for the midday meal, the smell of peas porridge has permeated the lower deck in a way that is, and this is not nothing, in the context of shipboard smells, actually pleasant. The men eat together, talking. What they talk about is what men in confined spaces always talk about when they are not talking about work: home, women, money owed and money promised, the particular incompetence of the third lieutenant, rumours about where the ship is, heading after the current cruise, a story someone heard in Portsmouth about a ship that found a treasure. The food is functional rather than delightful, but the social ritual around it is real and important, and the men who eat together in mess groups develop the kinds of social bonds that carry real meaning in the dangerous context of a sailing warship. Supper, late in the afternoon watch, is lighter. The remaining biscuit from the daily ration, perhaps a portion of cheese if the cheese ration has been issued that week, and for each man his daily rum ration, or rather his grog. The mixture of rum and water that is the day's most anticipated provision, consumed under the watchful eye of the officer of the watch, in the ritual distribution that marks the day's official end. The grog warms from inside in the cold North Atlantic air. Men who have been at sea long enough stop tasting the spirits and simply feel the warmth spreading outward from the stomach, which is, on a cold evening, 6 weeks from port, not a trivial thing. This daily picture was not static across the centuries, of course. It changed significantly between the Roman period and the Age of Sail, and between the early Age of Sail and the late 18th century, and again in the early 19th century as canning and improved provisioning began to supplement the traditional rations. The Japanese Imperial Navy of the late 19th century, studying the devastating impact of beriberi, a vitamin B1 deficiency caused by a diet based almost entirely on polished white rice, on their cruise, made the evidence-based decision to add barley to the naval diet and dramatically reduce the rate of the disease, in an episode that parallels the lemon juice story in both its positive result and the difficulty of achieving institutional change. The United States Navy, commissioning its first steam-powered vessels in the mid-19th century and thinking about the provisioning needs of longer cruises to distant stations, began experimenting with canned vegetables as supplements to the salt meat that still dominated the ration. And the physical conditions of eating changed too, with the technology of the ships. As the sailing warship gave way to the ironclad and then to the steel battleship and the submarine, the galley changed. Better stoves replaced the brick firebox. Refrigerated storage appeared for the first time in naval history. Specialized cooks replaced the wounded ratings who had previously managed the caboose. The transition from the wooden sailing ship kitchen to the modern naval galley took roughly a century, from the 1840s to the 1940s, and it was driven not by any single innovation, but by a cascade of developments: mechanical refrigeration, canning, better understanding of nutrition, better understanding of food safety, that together transformed what sailors ate from a constant exercise in creative deprivation to something that began to approach the expectations of the wider society the sailors came from. But even in the modern era, the challenge of feeding a ship's crew at sea retained some of its ancient character. The need to plan and store provisions for a voyage of fixed duration without reliable resupply, the importance of calorically dense, shelf-stable foods, the social dimension of eating in a mess, the use of food as a morale element in a confined and stressful environment. These were not abolished by refrigeration, or canning, or nutritional science. They persisted, in modified form, in the naval provisioning practices of the 20th and 21st centuries, recognizable descendants of the practices that had fed the triremes of Athens and the galleons of Spain. The salt beef was gone, but the discipline of planning, the culture of the mess, and the understanding that a fed sailor is a functional sailor had survived every technological revolution that the past 2,000 years had brought. We have travelled a long way, tonight. From the salt flats of ancient Portugal to the galley of a North Atlantic frigate, from the desperate Pacific crossing of Magellan's fleet to the confectionery kitchen of Nicholas Appert, from James Linn's citrus experiment on a ship in the Eastern Atlantic to the naval hospitals of the Napoleonic Wars, where lemon juice at last won the argument it had been making for 40 years. The story of how navies fed their sailors is, in the end, a story about human ingenuity under constraint, about what people invent and discover when the alternative to invention is death at sea. But the story is also larger than its naval frame. Almost every technology we have discussed tonight, salt curing, fermentation, drying, smoking, and eventually canning, left the realm of military logistics and entered the broader world of civilian food long before its naval application was complete. The Roman saltfish industry that fed the legions also fed the cities of the Mediterranean. The sauerkraut that kept Captain Cook's crew alive in the Pacific became a staple of European winter provisioning. The tin can invented for Napoleon's navy became the container that made it possible to feed the rapidly urbanizing populations of the Industrial Revolution. In a very real sense, the supermarket shelf, with its rows of canned vegetables, its packets of salt-cured fish, its jars of pickled produce, is the civilian descendant of the naval victualling yard. The salt that preserved the Roman fleet is still in every pantry in the world, used for the same basic purpose of inhibition and flavour it has always served. The fermentation techniques that made sauerkraut and pickled herring and aged cheeses shelf-stable are now the basis of a multi-billion-dollar global industry in fermented foods. The canning process that Nicolas Appert spent 15 years perfecting in his Paris kitchen is, in its fundamental principle, identical to the process used in every commercial cannery, and the world today, operating at a scale Appert could not have imagined, but using the same basic insight, seal, heat, cool, that he arrived at through patient observation. And the lessons about nutrition, about scurvy and vitamin deficiency, about the slow violence of a diet that lacks specific invisible components, were not only naval lessons. They were the first systematic demonstrations, worked out in the terrible laboratory of the sea, of the principle that specific substances in food are essential to human health, and that their absence is not a general weakness but a specific, identifiable, preventable failure. James Linn's trial aboard HMS Salisbury, with its pairs of sailors and its oranges and lemons, is a direct ancestor of the modern clinical trial. The argument that Gilbert Blaine made to the Admiralty, that the cost of providing adequate nutrition is less than the cost of the disease that inadequate nutrition causes, is the argument that every public health nutritionist makes today, in every country, about every dietary deficiency that remains preventable and yet persists. Tonight we have sailed a long way together, and the route we have followed has been one of the oldest and most human routes there is. The route that runs between hunger and the need to survive it, between the sea and the shore, between what we know and what we are willing to believe, between the problem and the solution that waits, sometimes for decades, for someone patient enough to insist on it. There is something quietly profound about the fact that so many of the foods we eat without a second thought carry within them the history of all this struggle. The pickled cucumber in a jar, the smoked mackerel in its vacuum packet, the tin of tomatoes on the shelf. Each one is a technological artifact as surely as a compass or a steam engine, the result of centuries of observation and experiment carried out by people whose names are mostly lost to us but whose practical intelligence shaped the material world we inhabit. When you open a tin of sardines and eat them at a kitchen table in the morning light, you are eating the descendant of the salted fish that fed Roman triremes, the cured herring that sustained Viking longships, the preserved provisions that kept Cook's Endeavour crew alive in the Pacific. The continuity is real, even if it is invisible. Sleep well tonight, knowing that the long, slow, imperfect, endlessly creative work of keeping people fed across oceans and centuries is part of the same human inheritance as every poem and every cathedral and every map that was ever made of a coast nobody had yet seen. The sea is quiet now. The watch has changed and the cook has banked the fire and the men in the mess are sleeping in their hammocks, breathing the salt air, moving with the slow motion of the ship on the dark water. They are fed, at least for tonight. That is, after all, what we were hoping for.